One of the most powerful forces in manga, and all of storytelling, is contrast. Contrast is what draws the eye to the dark spot on a bright page. Contrast is how you set expectations and then break them. Contrast is how you define something as interesting by how it's different from what's around it. One Piece chapter 1098 is a chapter of contrast. There is a journey in the chapter, between sorrow and joy and back to sorrow, again and again, from page to page and panel to panel. One is only so powerful because of its framing against the other. Framing achieved by deliberate paneling that doesn't just present these feelings on their own, but together. The first showing of contrast comes when the chapter juxtaposes the time Kuma learned about Ginny with him fighting to free yet another nation in the present. Imagine if this sequence was one and then the other. If we first saw Kuma learning about Ginny as its own scene, and then saw him fighting. Both scenes would function, but by mixing their panels together we accomplish more. We show how Kuma's mind is still trapped thinking about what happened to her even as he fights. Through the size of the panels on the page, with the revolution pages being so much larger, we gain the feeling that Kuma is stamping down his emotions, suppressing them to try and focus on what he has to do. And by jumping back and forth between them, we emphasize the joy of an island's freedom in contrast with Kuma's suffering. Neither we nor Kuma are allowed to settle into one of those feelings. He cannot be happy with his deeds, and he cannot process his emotions in solitude. The next two pages are my favorites in the chapter, and this is because the simple power of not showing things. Through deliberate camera angles and through tried and true visual storytelling techniques that Oda's been using for decades, like transponder snails, we never actually see Ginny while she's alive. Why did Oda make that choice? Because the horror of some things is more powerful if we don't see it. The feeling of not knowing just how bad a situation has got is a distinct feeling of its own from seeing something yourself, and that puts us in the mind of Kuma. Puts us in the mental space he's in, wanting to see her and yet being unable to. If we saw her here, we wouldn't be able to enter that headspace. Contrast fills every part of the story, as even here, the closeness they once had is now contrasted by the impossible distance between them. And most of all, I think it's important here that the story respects Ginny's wishes. Ginny does not want to be seen. And even when Kuma does find her, we only see incomplete glimpses. I think that when a character has been through such horrifying, unspeakable things, the right thing to do is to maintain some sense of dignity for them, to not define them by the worst of what's happened, but by their own decisions and agency that still carry some weight. The visual storytelling in this set of pages is also incredible in what it does show along with what it doesn't. Even before we find out how Ginny's disease works, the story builds tension for it with the imagery of the sun. This panel emphasizes sunlight with more than just having it in the panel. Look at the waves emanating out from it, and the harsh shadows on the boat. This page feels as scorchingly dry as a desert scene. You can practically hear the hawk sound effect. We feel how this sunlight is oppressive to her, pushing her down, and yet there's so much depth in seeing it because Ginny has chosen this. Ginny has accepted this decision. She has chosen freedom even when it's packaged with suffering. The sun may be painful, but it is still bright. While across on the next page, right next to it, contrasting the sun, is a horrible storm at the revolutionaries' base. And I think it's fairly obvious what mood that implies and how it contrasts what Ginny is feeling. Also, I've talked for a couple videos in a row about how important it is to maintain consistent imagery for locations, and we get another payoff of that, in that we immediately understand that Kuma has come back to Sorbet Kingdom just from how it looks. It's simple, but how many mangas simply can't pull something off like this because their locations are not distinct enough? And this isn't like the most important location in the story, this is a random-ass kingdom that's really only important for this one flashback. Like before, we're mixing images together, we're going back and forth, we're juxtaposing them. And this makes it feel like we can't linger in one or the other. We are forced to see that both are true. There is a reason the story had to show some of Ginny's corpse, and that's because, with as visual as One Piece is, we do need to show how the disease looks, so we can understand it's the same disease once it appears on Bonnie. But we begin to see joy return with these beautiful shots of the sun coming in. The symbolism is simple but powerful, and it definitely ties into Nika as well. Kuma is being freed from his pain with someone new to his love, and the sun is about freedom. While Ginny could have just hidden away, she chose freedom along with the pain. The next page is full of great visual storytelling in a way where there's not even much to say about it without just describing what's on the page. Every panel has a purpose. It's showing some different step in what it's like to raise a child and a different part of how Kuma feels. This panel of Bonnie is one of the greatest panels in all of One Piece. Like, just look at her. Isn't she neat? I like the final row, where after a page full of domesticity, it shocks us with more of the violence Kuma enacts. Contrast is back, onto the next page, this time juxtaposing Kuma's revolutionary actions with his simple life raising Bonnie. A man who fights for the revolution can be a little interesting. A man who raises his daughter can be too. A man who does both, who holds that contrast within him, of violence and of gentleness, is more interesting than either on their own. That's the kind of man worth writing a several chapter backstory about. I'm not sure if I've made this clear enough, so to be clear, the paneling is a big part of this. The contrast is there in the story concepts, but the contrast is also there in that we deliberately show one after the other. You could argue that I stretched the definition of paneling here, but to me, paneling is really about every choice involved in what you show and how you show it. The choice to show Kuma feeding Bonnie, then Kuma leaving Bonnie with an old lady, and then Kuma fighting in the revolution, is a visual choice as much as it is a story choice, and those two things blend together. As we continue to develop that contrast, we also have something a little less negative for Kuma right before things really go bad. The flow here is very deliberate. We have Kuma washing Bonnie, into Kuma fighting in a battle, into Kuma sleeping with a cage around Bonnie to make sure that he doesn't hurt her, which is hilarious, to Kuma training Sabo. Training Sabo is not so much of a negative thing, it's not about violence, it's not as violent in such a bad way, but it still is a responsibility of a revolutionary, and its placement here is really deliberate because we have to have something that's not quite as negative so we can jump into something really negative next. It's all about contrast. We wouldn't have that same feeling if we saw Kuma training Sabo first and then saw him fighting in a battle, if we reversed the order of these. And at the bottom of the page, we have some of the best visual storytelling in the chapter. Sunlight was Ginny's death, and yet Kuma's redemption, with the shot of the sunbeams coming through the window as he found new love in his life for his daughter. Both of those moments of visual setup are tied together here, as we are struck with the shot of the windows being boarded up. The way that this shift in Kuma's life, losing the joy that he had before, is represented through something so visual, something so visceral, something that conveys that he is rejecting the positivity that he once had, yet for the sake of avoiding that pain, is a perfect example of what makes Oda's style so unique and skillful. You can tell the story of a man who struggles with his daughter's sickness, but to represent it through imagery like this is on another level. We have the payoff of seeing Ginny's sickness visually because it makes it easier to understand exactly what's happening to Bonnie. And sure, this is explained in the dialogue. It probably wouldn't be super hard to understand if this wasn't here, but again, this is One Piece. Why make something not visual when we can make it visual? A moment I like on this page is how we jump immediately from the shot of Kuma's two friends finding out that Bonnie is sick, to them already running away to find a doctor. It wouldn't change the story much if they just said they'd get a doctor while still there, but the fact that we don't even see them start moving, only see them when they already are running away, that they didn't even hesitate to do everything they can to help, helps show that they're good guys, that it wasn't even a question that they would try to do their part. The page of Bonnie fighting the bullies is the one action page I get to talk about this week, and it is barely an action page, but I am counting it anyway. We have some great right-to-left motion as Bonnie chases the bullies away, and I like how much of the page she takes up after that, popping out over the panel borders. As usual, we are emphasizing the depth of her feelings over theirs, and showing that she has a strong personality both in her size on the page and in her posture. Even when she's not moving, her line of action is forward, showing her aggression. The page also emphasizes that Bonnie is on the right and the bullies are on the left. And this is more important than it usually is in Oda's action pages, and it's usually very important, because part of the dynamic of this scene is the barrier she's not supposed to cross, and so we need a sense of that barrier being between them. We even emphasize the divide by having her arm, as she gives them the finger, align with that barrier. As the eye travels down from this panel into the kick, it aligns with the position of the bully's body, while still respecting that the motion should be from right to left. Bonnie's actions here are tying into both her situation and her personality. We've acknowledged that that barrier existed, and then we showed that she will threaten to cross it. On the next page, we can see just as much personality in Kuma's posture, the way he holds Bonnie back gently, the way he has an open palm in peace and calmness. I love the way he's kneeling down to talk to her. That's a thing you do when talking to children. You try to go down to their level, but he's so huge that it doesn't really work and he's still way above her. The angle is slightly upwards because we're looking up at him from Bonnie's younger perspective, and at our shot of Bonnie next, we're looking down at her to match Kuma's perspective. And then we resolve that difference by bringing them together. As we continue through to the end of the chapter, we continue to oscillate between joy and sorrow, contrasting them against each other. It's hard to talk about how important this is without just repeating myself, because there's only really so many ways you can say it, but every moment just hits harder when there's something else. If there's just a story where only bad things happen and there's no depth to it, it's just here's another bad thing after another bad thing, nobody cares. It's just lame. It's not even grimdark, it's just edgy. You need to have both, even if it's just a little, just for things to feel real. And there's such an even interesting divide in Kuma's story because it really shows that he had a life worth living even if it was a life full of pain. We see the joy of fatherhood and the joy of dancing with the Song of Nika right before we see the sheer sorrow of learning that she is going to die. We've spent this whole chapter going back and forth between the two. One panel of Kuma's joy, one panel of his sorrow, his action and his revolution, and then his pain and the people he couldn't save. This chapter has been leading. This is a chapter of him being ping-ponged between two extremes. But it's here, at the end of the chapter, that those two contrasting elements are finally pushed together. Kuma's pain and Bonnie's joy in the same panels. It's both together at once. That her joy here is itself a source of sorrow. That someone so young, so cheerful and innocent will be lost. All of these panels have a dynamic between them. Bonnie on top of Kuma as Kuma himself feels pressured by her joy. The joy itself is a source of pain, and that is a more complex contrast than most of what we've even seen before now. Boy, that is a downer. But hey, we know Bonnie lives at least, so on that positive note, subscribe! I make videos about One Piece's paneling every week, and if you're enjoying them, give them a like. If there's anything about the paneling I didn't notice that you thought was cool, or if you have a suggestion for a chapter to cover on a break week, leave a comment. And tune in next week, where I will be talking about what might be the best paneled action chapter in all of One Piece. Stay tuned.